Now, Mark Urban is with us, as he is every Monday, to talk through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark.
Morning, Hugo.
Morning. Thanks for being with us. Let's start with Ukraine and Vladimir Zelensky, because he's heading to Downing Street later for meetings with the Prime Minister. And Donald Trump has accused him of not reading US-backed peace proposals. British officials have stressed that any peace deal must allow Ukraine to determine its own future, not reward Russian aggression. There are, of course, these proposals that have come out of the US, and Trump has said pretty plainly that Zelensky hasn't even read it. He said, "I'm disappointed that the President Zelensky hasn't read the proposal." He says, "Russia's fine with it, but I'm not sure Zelensky's fine with it. His people love it, but he hasn't read it." Does that seem likely, Mark, that he hasn't read it?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, look, some people were not quite sure which iteration of this plan President Trump was referring to, because obviously we had the original, the so-called 28-point plan. But people, Europeans and indeed Ukrainians, then went to Geneva to, if you like, turn the plan more towards their interests, tone it down in terms of its what it was giving away to the Russians. And now it's iterated in a further form, and indeed probably will do today at these meetings in London. So we don't really know which draft President Trump is referring to. I mean, all one can say is that from Zelensky's point of view, it's sometimes probably best just to imply that he hasn't read the latest one, and then you don't have to comment on it when you're asked about it. But
well, that's a good strategy. Look, one gets the strong sense, Mark, of the screws tightening on Zelensky, tightening indeed on Ukraine at the moment. Is that reasonable?
I think it is. Look, we've talked about this over the past 15 months. These things that are evolving do so very gradually. You know, just as the Russians have lost hundreds of thousands of casualties, taking pretty small amounts of eastern Ukraine, so Ukraine's financial position has been eroded slowly. But I think now we can see several things coming together. So as far as the US is concerned, both the money and weapons coming through are very, very limited now. And that's quite different from a year or 18 months ago. The issue about whether the EU is prepared to exploit frozen Russian funds to continue financing Ukraine's war is a very live issue in the EU, and it hasn't been solved yet. So that's quite a big question. I mean, literally, you know, in a few months' time, how would Ukraine pay its civil servants or keep the lights on are going to be in question unless the EU can come up with an answer to financing the war. And then, of course, you've got the battlefield situation where extraordinarily and despite all the suffering of the Ukrainian military, they have held on. But we know that Russian tactics have improved somewhat during this summer. There have been instances where the Ukrainian lines have successfully been infiltrated because the Ukrainian troops are so thin on the ground now because of their issues in recruiting and holding on to soldiers that, you know, the situation is pretty tenuous on the front line as well. So all of those things combine, plus, of course, the Trump factor, the president's impatience for a deal, to put Zelensky in a very tricky position. But as we've known all along, you know, there are Ukrainian red lines. He's never going to admit in any substantive legal way that Russia has the right to those eastern territories that it's conquered. You know, he's never going to agree to restrictions on the size and equipment of the Ukrainian army and other forces, for example, that would, in the view of Ukraine, leave them unable to defend themselves. So, you know, there are still red lines, and there are still reasons why Zelensky would and indeed is carrying on fighting, even under this kind of pressure from America.
Let's take a couple of those in turn then. First, then the military picture, Mark. I mean, how should we see that? Should we see as Russia basically making some limited advances that they hope will advantage them when it comes to negotiations? Or should we be thinking that, you know what, actually the front line in Ukraine could break, Russia could make significant incursions, this war could in fact have a military end?
Well, if you go back a couple of years, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive had failed to deliver in the summer of 2023, for example, and in the autumn of that year, I think both sides still had this idea that they might break through, or that in the Ukrainian case, because of the revolt by the Wagner Group and Prigozhin, there might be some way that they could put such pressure on Russia in terms of losses and failure to meet their objectives that someone might overthrow Putin. Now, I think both of those ideas, that i.e., the Russian one of a sort of dramatic breakthrough, and the Ukrainian one of getting Putin overthrown, have been shown by time and bitter experience to be rather unrealistic. So while you can't rule out either of those options, I think we'd be dumb if we didn't look at the past couple of years and say, well, however much supporters of Ukraine might hope that's what happens in Moscow, it really doesn't look very likely. From the Ukrainian perspective, I think the real difficulty is, although the Russians have not succeeded in breaking through this summer, and there must be a lot of relieved people in the higher command of the Ukrainian military about that, they do have these great problems with getting enough people. And a lot of the people who they're conscripting are promptly deserting. There was a pretty extraordinary statistic given a few weeks ago by a senior Ukrainian officer that the total number of people who were absent without leave, who'd either deserted or not come back when they got some home leave, was equal to the number of soldiers actually in the front line now. So hundreds of thousands. So these are pretty significant problems. And I think the underlying factor there on the military side is it means that for some time, and Zelensky has recognized this, there has been no military possibility of reconquering that 20% or so of the country that is occupied by Russia. And Russia is therefore betting with enormous numbers of lives of its own people that it will exhaust Ukraine's willingness to resist and bring about some kind of peace agreement or ceasefire, which is very advantageous to Russia.
So look, finally, before we move on from this then, Mark, as I said, Zelensky is in Downing Street today. He's going to be meeting with Keir Starmer. What should we be looking for, if anything, to come out of that meeting? Is it a sort of symbolic showing allyship? Is there a chance that they might come to an agreement on the money we were talking about? Could something actually come out of it, or is it just sort of showing that we're still on side?
Yeah, I think there are two things. I think the first is to try and rally a common European position on these peace proposals, given the energy with which Donald Trump is pushing this case, and to rally behind Zelensky at the European level. Look, we know that Russia may well then say that alterations made to the plan by Zelensky and the Europeans make it unacceptable to them. And so in that sense, we'd have a rinse repeat of something that's already happened a couple of times since Donald Trump came to power. So that's one important factor is do they actually seriously think peace is possible? And is there still a conceivable landing zone between Ukraine and Russia on the terms of that peace? I think that's pretty unlikely. And that then leads to the second key question of the day, which is that if the EU continues to have trouble reaching agreement about borrowing against the 200 billion euros or so of frozen Russian money in the EU, so the idea was they would borrow against it to give zero interest loans to Ukraine to carry on the war. If that continues to be problematic because Belgium, Hungary, and one or two other countries don't want to do that in the EU, will they pass the hat round and have another round of substantial financial contributions to keep Ukraine in the war? And that would be billions in the case of the UK and Germany and other countries that want to support Ukraine. They would each have to come up with very substantial amounts of money in order to do that.
Yeah, indeed. Look, moving on from this, but I suppose, as everything linked, the US has issued its latest national security strategy just at the end of last week, which has been praised by Moscow but landed like something of a bomb in Brussels. It talks of civilizational collapse in Europe, and it has far more criticism for the EU and Europe generally than it does for Russia. I mean, I guess fundamentally, Mark, the question here is, what are the Americans playing at?
Well, it's yeah, civilizational erasure, I think, is the
Mm,
idea. This kind of set of beliefs that people around Trump have, that sort of combination of the failure to control immigration, low birth rate, generous welfare, low spending on defense, all of these things have come together in a catastrophic way, and the character of Europe is changing very quickly. I mean, look, some aspects of this I think are unarguable in the statistical sense. For example, the crisis in the birth rate
hmm
in many European countries. That's not really possible to argue with. I mean, you can argue that all Western countries have got pretty low birth rates right now, and there are lots of reasons for it. And the European attempts to deal with that are simply aspects of European policy that Trump and his ideological ilk don't like. But the broader arc of it, and as you started off in your question mentioning Russia's endorsement, now that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, to have a US national security strategy endorsed by the Kremlin in those terms that, oh yes, in most respects, we sort of agree with it, is I think a mark of the kind of turning point that we're at in terms of the Trump presidency, and the sense that what Trump is doing in a way is what Russia and China have wanted America to do for the past 10, 15 years, which is to acknowledge the so-called multipolar world. Now, there was that moment, after the collapse of Soviet communism in the 1990s when people talked about monopolarity, i.e., America calling all the shots and trying to run the world, the end of history, all of that stuff. But I think realistically, we are in a world in which not just China challenges the United States for the top slot, the most powerful country in the world, which it clearly is in certain economic terms now, manufacturing and all the rest of it, its control of certain strategic minerals. But you've also got a lot of actors appearing at the sort of intermediate level. And by that, I mean countries like India, who are pretty militarily powerful, very economically strong, and are supplanting Western influence in big parts of the world. Now, Russia and China like talking to India, on equal terms and without reference to the West. And I guess the question, if you're European or American, is how does the West stay relevant and still achieve what it wants to in that world in which United States power is no longer there as the sort of ultimate big stick of a set of, a kind of Western defined rules-based order. And in that context, I don't think taking chunks out of the Europeans and the Americans taking chunks out of one another is a particularly wise strategic way of doing that.
Well, I'm fascinated as to whether this is sort of in America's interest, because if they're publishing, documents like this, basically saying I mean, basically with such hostility towards Europe, and us in this, the United Kingdom in this regard being basically a part of Europe, part of what they're talking about, then it's kind of like, why should we continue to think of them as allies if they increasingly don't think of us as allies? And you can imagine, there seems to be this assumption on the part of America that we will continue to regard them as our major geopolitical ally. But if they are this hostile to everything about our continent, why would we do that?
Well, I mean, this is the recalculation that a lot of people are making right
Mm,
now, isn't it, Hugo? And I think, to be honest, the writing has been on the wall since pretty early on this year, when you had a couple of sort of big set piece moments. There was Pete Hegseth at NATO, and then there was his Trump's vice president JD Vance at the Munich Security Conference, pretty much saying the sort of things that are in this national security strategy that was
mm,
released last week, both attacking, particularly Vance, attacking Europe and its conception of democracy, but also this frequent charge of being like freeloaders in terms of US defense. And of course, the truth is that an awful lot of Americans do think that Europe does freeload. So the writing has been on the wall these past 11 months, I would say. And to some extent, European countries have woken up and have started to think in concrete terms. Germany, for example, and to spend a lot more on their security and to try and work out how Europe might defend itself without that ultimate guarantee of American power. But that, as they say, is a work in progress. It's a pretty big tectonic shift if that indeed is what we're witnessing. And the Americans, to be frank, are a little ambiguous about that. There are times when the administration still says it believes in NATO and collective security in the North Atlantic and still sort of accepts that it needs allies. It can't do everything on its own. And there are other times when effectively you get the impression that they would like to basically leave NATO. And at the end of all of this, I'll wrap up the thoughts. But NATO's always been based on this idea, the sort of sacred idea, that United States, in a supreme emergency, i.e., a formerly Soviet Russian, now Russian military challenge to Europe, it would be prepared to risk its own cities in order to defend Europe, risk nuclear destruction, the whole works. And I don't think that's there anymore. So in that key sense, we have to ask whether NATO is still operative as an alliance.
Bleak, thank you very much indeed. Mark Urban. Look, you can, of course, read Mark every week in the Sunday Times as well as hearing him on this show. Mark, thank you very much indeed.